I'm Yvonne Hamoud, registered social worker and owner of New Moon Counseling, but out of the office, I'm a mom, wife, daughter, sister, and friend. Join me each week as I sit with a special guest to discuss everyday things that impact our mental health. We'll be chatting about everything from mental health and relationships to media and current events, as well as personal experiences and reflections, all in the hopes of normalizing our humanness and helping you see that you're not alone. This is Outside the Therapy Room. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Outside the Therapy Room. Today, we are joined by my very good friend, Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
I'm so happy to have you on here. So, Stephanie, you have your own podcast called Caregivers Compass. Your whole practice is all around caregivers. So I wanted to have you on today to talk a little bit about caregivers and the holidays, because it can be a mix of excitement, joy, grief, loneliness, burnout, a whole bunch of stuff that can kind of come from that. So thank you for being here to talk about those things today. But before we get started, can you please introduce yourself to the listeners?
Absolutely. And it's such a pleasure to be here. So my name is Stephanie Muskat. I am a registered social worker and I run a psychotherapy practice, as Yvonne just said, called Compassion in Caregiving. And as Yvonne said, the holidays can be full of complexity. And I'm really glad that we're talking about that here today.
Yeah. And because we are outside the therapy room, I like to ask all of our guests a little bit about themselves outside of their profession or their therapeutic space. Are you comfortable sharing a little bit about you outside of your profession?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll share a bit about why I got into what I do. And that stemmed from the fact that I was a caregiver for my mom, but at a time when caregiving was not this known thing. I don't even know if the word caregiver was really stated that much back then. And I saw a lot of gaps. I experienced what caregiving was for myself. I was 19, so I was in university. And it started this drive and passion in me to look more into caregiving, but also specifically caregiver mental health, because mental health was already something that I was interested in. And I experienced my own mental health struggles caring for my mom. And so over time, working with caregivers, the people they care for, inpatient, because I worked inpatient for a while in the hospital system, and continuing to see the gaps that I saw, I started Compassion in Caregiving. So what I do stems from my own drive and what I enjoy. I also am a mom. I have little kids. I have a doggy. I really like to spend time with all of them when I can, but when you see me, I think a lot of the time I will be working and spreading awareness and trying to make systems change and policy change, because we also do that aside from the therapy practice. We're trying to do so much in the lens of caregiving. So you'll mostly see me interacting with caregivers and policymakers.
Yeah. It has been awesome just as a friend to kind of see you kind of grow into that, speaking and, advocacy and all of those things. So it's been really cool. Proud friend over here. Thank you so much for sharing all of those things. I think, again, we've talked about this like in our own kind of conversations, but kind of being the sandwich, people who are parents and also caring for their own parents or family members or loved ones. Like, we're kind of sandwiched in the middle of these two things where we're kind of needing to provide this care to these two different relationships that we have in our lives. And a lot of the times, especially around the holidays, we're busy. I mean, our last episode was all about parenting overwhelm of wanting to create this magical space for our kids. But when we're also having to caretake and wanting to have some of the magic that we remember with that family member, it can be a lot. And so what are some of the most common emotions that you see caregivers experience around the holidays?
Yeah, so caregivers, I think, experience emotions that they would experience at all other times, but they can be exacerbated because of what's happening around the holiday season. So we see a lot of grief, all sorts of grief, ambiguous grief, anticipatory grief, grief in general.
Mhm.
And I'll clarify that maybe a little bit later on. We see resentment, we see anger, we see anxiety, we see, all, like, if you think of an emotion, they have it. Guilt,
Mhm.
shame, everything comes up with
Yeah.
caregiving in general, and for sure holidays can exacerbate those things.
Guilt. Yeah, that's a big
Yeah.
one too, for
Yeah.
sure. For folks who maybe don't know all these different types of grief, can you share a little bit about what the difference is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, anticipatory grief is grieving what you think might happen in the future. So, for example, if you're caring for somebody who has an overall progressive cognitive degeneration, that means that their brain is going to change likely over time. And so, the person that you know them to be might also change over time. So, worrying or grieving and feeling pain about the future and what that's going to look like, even their death. Uh, Ambiguous loss is loss that we can't really pinpoint, but we know that it's there and it's just kind of floating in the air. And a lot of people don't know that this is grief and loss, but it is. And we name that a lot in therapy for our clients. That,
Mhm.
oh, you're grieving, but it feels very strange. It feels ambiguous. There's also, there's many different types of loss, but naming grief as something that happens over time in the process of caregiving is really important, because we are grieving the life we had, we are grieving the life we expected, we are grieving the person in front of us, the relationship and dynamic we might have had, the friends outside of that dynamic that shift too, and the family dynamics that shift
Mhm.
as well. And so, yeah, there are a lot of different types of grief. I think last time I looked, there were like six or seven or eight, but
Yeah.
those are the main ones that we see for sure.
And how do we see, I mean, you shared some examples, but how do we see this show up in the clients that you support, like especially around the holidays? I can again just imagine, that ambiguous loss of, the holidays now can't be the way I imagined them to be or how I hoped they would be. But what are some other anticipatory grief or ambiguous loss that shows up for the clients that you work with?
So I find that when clients are younger, so we do see young caregivers in their teens and 20s and early 30s, they definitely feel that loss of the magic of the holidays more, that loss of the joy of the holidays more, because there is an expectation of what it's going to look like.
Mhm.
Usually at that age, they're still going to their parents for the holidays, or they're going to, aunts and uncles or grandparents. So that's a very big shift for them. And they're really noticing, especially the first time it happens. I find the first holiday season to be the worst, when they're experiencing the most profound grief, because they're seeing the largest shifts.
Yeah.
With my older clients, though, I'll be honest, they tend to be at a different stage in their life in general. We're not
Mhm.
everybody, but a lot of them don't see the holidays anymore as this like magical thing. They're just, yeah, it's the holidays, it's complex, it's full of
Yeah.
dynamics. Or a lot of their focus, if they've been caregiving for a while, is on, I hope that mom or my sister or my grandma aren't going to end up in the hospital this holiday season. And that's where their focus is. And it's a win for
Mhm.
them if they're home. So I definitely see different levels of it, but I do find the shift in focus as people enter different stages of their life being, the main component of how we see loss and grief around the holidays.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess it changes because of their
Yeah.
experience and the reality in that, right? Like you said, somebody kind of at the beginning of it, it's just so fresh. And so coming around the holiday season, there may be a lot more grief than somebody who's been in it. It
Yeah.
kind of has more of like a realistic outlet in terms of like, okay, they're in the hospital, they're not in the hospital. And that can be again really just like a shift in
Yeah.
how they view like some traditions and things like that.
Yeah, there's also grief in comparison. So, if
Oh
you're a
yeah.
parent caring for a child who has complex medical needs or special needs, you want to try and make that holiday for your child the way that you're looking around seeing other people making the holiday for their children, but that
Mhm.
may not be realistic, right? Some people might be taking their kids to Disney World, for the Mickey parade. I don't know.
Yeah.
And your life looks very different when you're really just trying to get through your day, or not be in the hospital, or if you are in the hospital, what does that look like? And so there is
Mhm.
grief in comparing to other people and seeing what you don't have and what you wish you would have had, for
Mhm.
sure. So that's a reality for parents too.
Yeah, those are tough. I mean, we've talked about that in previous
Mm.
episodes too, just the comparisons and too with like social media being like
Oh
a
yeah.
very real thing that we're always on. Like it can be so easy to fall into this spiral of like, oh, I'm stuck here and this is what this person's going through.
Yeah.
You touched again like on the grief portion of it, but I think there's also been some misconceptions around, people. Yeah, there's been some misconceptions that people have around caregivers. I think especially in December, there can, again, maybe people aren't aware of it or don't know it and so have these misconceptions. What would you say are some of those misconceptions that you hear maybe from some of the clients that you work with or that you've seen around you?
Yeah, so I think one of the misconceptions is that caregiving is this like beautiful symbiotic thing. I actually
Yeah.
posted about that yesterday. And there is this expectation that, well, if you're a caregiver, you must still find it so beautiful and you're making these joyous moments with this person and you're having,
Mhm.
the best time with this person. And that's not always reality. We know a lot of caregivers don't choose to be caregivers. They don't feel like this person is their quote unquote loved one, and this
Yeah.
is now a responsibility that's been thrust onto them, and they're trying to do their best, but they're also feeling resentful because if they're having to care for this person, let's say at a family dinner, like they're the ones responsible for that, it is taking them away from the other things that they were able to do, or they're feeling anger because maybe other family members aren't stepping up the way that they would have hoped, or whatever it might be. So that's one common misconception I'm starting to see a lot. We see caregiving portrayed in common media as this like amazing thing, and it can be, but
Mhm.
there are a lot of underlying nuances still. Like caregiving is hard, even if you really like it, it's hard.
Yeah.
And then there's a spectrum of what that can look like. Another misconception is that, it's that every caregiver really cares about the holidays in general. I also thought this was really interesting and striking when I first started to work with caregivers, because my
Mhm.
assumption was, oh my gosh, holidays must be like the hardest thing ever for you because things look
Yeah.
different, because that's how it felt to me. But I slowly learned that a lot of people don't even care about the holidays and they're like, whatever, it's just another day. So again, there's a broad spectrum. Some people really do care and some people don't. But I think
Mhm.
we need to get away from that generalist assumption and thinking that everybody's kind of the same, when in reality, just like everyone's different in society, everyone has a different perspective, and a different approach to care.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, even just noticing your own assumptions when you first started, it's like,
Yeah.
we have this, we don't know what we don't know. And
Yeah.
we can make a lot of these assumptions. I think, something that I've seen from some caregivers online has been, and it's maybe not a misconception, but just like judgments towards what the outcome needs to be if they have to put a family member in a facility in a home in long-term care. There's a lot of judgment around that when in reality, like, we don't know what they're going through. And I think sometimes the misconception is like, oh, if you're a caregiver, you chose this, and so you're going to choose to have the family member in your home or be like around them all the time, and that's not always possible. And so,
Yeah. Of
yeah.
course. Absolutely.
So I know you mentioned a little bit at the beginning about you being a caregiver yourself. And I know from like following you and being your friend that a lot of the work that you do is around the folks who have frontotemporal degeneration or FTD. Can you speak to the specific emotional challenges that caregivers face when supporting someone with FTD? And I also want to note that maybe folks are more familiar with FTD because there is a celebrity, Bruce
Mhm.
Willis, who has had this diagnosis, and we've seen his partner and his kids and his ex-partner kind of communicate about this to the media and publicly. And so, yeah, what are some of the emotional challenges you see caregivers experience?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question. So, for people who don't know, frontotemporal degeneration is a type of degeneration or a dementia that happens over time that is very different from the Alzheimer's that we might see as the most common type of dementia. And so, while an Alzheimer's might present initially as memory loss, frontotemporal degeneration can present in three ways, but there's two main ways. One is called primary progressive aphasia, which is where they lose words or they lose the ability to communicate. And that's how it presents itself initially. It's more complicated than that, but that's a general, overall view. And there's a behavioral variant, frontotemporal dementia, in which the way it starts is that the person starts to exhibit behaviors, physical and verbal aggression, impulsivity, obsessions. And so, because my mom had frontotemporal dementia, it is a very specific interest of mine. And a lot of clinicians don't know what this illness is and how to approach it. So, when people tend to have that and come our way to the practice, I do tend to take all of those on because of my knowledge and my passion for those clients.
Mhm.
So, I'm going to specifically talk about the behavioral variant FTD in terms of emotions, because I think that that's the one that gets highlighted the most in my practice. And if we think about the behavior component, imagine that you have someone that you know and you love or you don't love, but you have a relationship with them, and suddenly they start to swear at you, scream at you out of nowhere, hit you, kick you, punch the wall. When you're in public, they are taking their clothes off, police are getting called on them. That's what this disease can start to look like in the beginning. And when you don't know what that is, and it takes a very long time to get a diagnosis, because oftentimes it is confused with a mental health diagnosis,
Mm.
you can only imagine what's happening to the relationship and the complexities around the relationship with that illness. But
Mhm.
oftentimes they also have difficulty with problem solving. They have difficulty managing finances. It's like sudden and it's progressive. And so people start to have to take care of them in some way, whether that's, the house, the bills, whatever it is. But yet imagine doing that. And then that person is still hitting you, kicking you, yelling at you, swearing at you. And now imagine that this person is your parent or your sibling or your aunt or your uncle, and you had a dynamic with them where they were your nurturer. And suddenly
Mhm.
that is shifted. So you can already start to see how complex this can be. And I think, caregivers do have a lot of overlapping emotions, but what I find to be specific with the behavioral FTD, again, is profound grief, confusion around the loss, but tremendous anger and frustration because
Mhm.
why is this person treating me this way? What happened to our relationship and dynamic shift? Or if you're not very close to them, I don't want anything to do with them anymore, cutting them off. So my mom was cut off by almost every single person in her life because that's what they thought. They were like, what happened to this person? She just became a volatile human being.
Mhm.
Um, and still having to take care of the person every single day, regardless of all of those things, right?
Right.
So there is a lot of guilt because they think the behaviors are their fault. There's a lot of
Mm.
shame because they think the behaviors are their fault. Like everything gets turned onto its head,
Yeah.
and that is usually what we'll see in the beginning. And then there's a lot of emotions about navigating the healthcare system to get a diagnosis, and then also once you get the diagnosis, what do you do with that? Because
Mhm.
it's kind of just like, well, this is progressively declining, so there's nothing we can do but have a nice day. Like that's essentially what people
Right.
are told.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, I painted the picture. You can probably imagine what people go through. um,
Yeah.
and there's no fix, there's no control, and there's no cure. So
Mm.
there's no answers. So then they're dealing with this very out of control situation, sparking anxiety and you know, everything else.
Mhm. Yeah, but also isolating for the caretaker if
Oh
everyone else
yeah.
in that person's lives have like set that boundary, even though they don't really know exactly what's going on.
Yeah. So
And so, yeah, it's so isolating and just it puts it so much on the caregiver. And like you mentioned, like, blame that they might hold themselves and guilt and all of that. Um, Again, you painted quite the picture. You have no control and you're seeing this person kind of slowly fade into somebody that you don't even recognize. And it's, yeah, like that grief that we talked about. You mentioned the blame. And I think that, that maybe can span around, caregivers for a variety of different behavioral or health conditions. But like, what do caregivers often blame themselves for that isn't actually their fault?
Oh, so many things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of blame around, like something I hear often, and you'd be like, what? There's a lot of self blame around falls,
Mm,
falls risk and falls prevention, because as someone declines, and it's not just dementia, it's stroke. It can be stroke, it can be traumatic brain injury, it can be ALS.
mm,
There is a loss of the ability to control the motor skills of the body, and
right.
so there are falls. So I do see people oftentimes blaming themselves for falls, not being able to give the care that this person deserves as they progress and things get more and more difficult.
Hmm.
Blame and feeling angry because they feel like they shouldn't feel angry. Blame and getting angry, so yelling or saying things that maybe they didn't want to say, they feel
Right.
very badly about that. Blame in behaviors, blame in having to place the person, as you talked about before.
Hmm.
uh Blame in this person not having the life that they wanted to, even though the illness is not the fault of the caregiver at all, still
Right.
feeling like it's up to them to give them this life. And then a big one is, and there's so many things, but a big one is blame about how the end of the life goes,
Mm.
and trying to put that on themselves and make their end of life have to be exactly what they want, when in reality it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah. Wow, that's so much blame that somebody's placing on themselves when yeah, it's not even their fault. Even
Hmm.
just the falls, like you said, right? So we try to do everything we can to avoid that from happening, and it can still happen. And that's again just so much of that emotional burden that they're carrying on, just again around themselves in this space as a caregiver, and then not to mention add everything else on top of it, work, holiday family dynamics, kids, like all of these other things. It just sounds completely overwhelming and like
Yeah.
again isolating if other family members don't really recognize the extent of how much work they have to do or understand or want are willing to kind of support. Yeah, that can be really hard. In
Hmm.
terms of like some of the things that you mentioned as well with FTD, and any kind of cognitive or behavioral changes in loved ones, how do they impact family gatherings or holiday routines? Because again, we talked about like the grief, and now you have a family member who's, behaving very differently, or not able to be as present as they were previously. And yeah, how does
Yeah.
that look?
There's a lot of fear about what might this person do at the event. The responsibility of the caregiver or the family member or the friend of, can I manage the behaviors? What about the after effect of behaviors? Can this person even come? Am I going to keep them from the gathering because it's not a safe
Mm,
environment? And then also, these gatherings can be very overstimulating for the person who has the behavior. And we have to also keep in mind that we are maybe triggering them, and that can exacerbate behaviors, or that can also
right.
lead to issues down the road, maybe not in that moment, but it can lead to confusion later on. So there is a lot of pressure on the caregiver to navigate this. And I've been there personally. It's awful. Like, the stress of that is really, really awful.
Mm,
Also, drinking alcohol isn't great for dementias and cognitive impairment, but yet, are we the one to tell this person, oh, you can't have a drink, when they really enjoyed their drink? Or if they're in the early stages, but they're having, vestibular issues, so they're dizzy or whatever. A lot of times driving is implicated. Are we letting them drive to this event? Are we taking away
mm.
some of their autonomy? So that those are larger picture issues.
Yeah, yeah, but again, the actual individual who's dealing with all of these health concerns is, yeah, like they're going through their own grief of not being able
Yeah,
to drink or all of that.
exactly. Yeah.
It's just, there's so much within that from each individual person who's experiencing it. It just sounds like, again, it can be hard then to have those conversations around expectations and everything, again, depending where that family member is at.
Yeah.
um yeah, I've mentioned a couple times, like, my dad having a stroke and having to kind of take care of that. I feel like, always kind of being a caretaker, because my parents were immigrants, I had to translate for them, so I was a caregiver in some sense, not really fully in the sense that we're talking about right now. But I remember kind of feeling this pressure to have things go as perfectly as they can, so that, they everyone can just have a good time and we can just be present in this moment.
Mhm.
And so, like, I can imagine some of your clients or some caregivers with everything kind of feeling like family members and loved ones are declining in their health, feeling this pressure to kind of create a magical or memorable moment or season. And so, how
Mhm.
do you help clients challenge or soften that pressure? Because again, that's just something that's added on top of all of this pressure, guilt, blame, all of these emotions that we've talked about already. So, yeah, is there anything that you kind of suggest or ways that you support clients when they're feeling this pressure for themselves?
Yeah, so I think it depends on how somebody tends to like what direction they tend to veer in and what their tendencies are, their personality type, or how they deal with out of control stress and anxiety. So I definitely have the clients who really try to get assert control and they go
Mm,
towards perfectionism, or that can even show itself as disordered eating tendencies. It can show itself as obsessive exercise. It can show itself as
mm,
over control in other ways, or over distraction. I also have clients who go the other way and they're like, I can't deal with anything. And they're the opposite and they're not trying to do anything. They're actually like losing that,
mm,
perfectionistic quality that maybe they somewhat had. But for the ones who do try to be perfect, we are looking at what the underlying emotions are for whatever is leading them in that direction, looking at the out of control and focusing on things that they can control. Soothing or comforting methods that they can implement so that when they are feeling those underlying emotions and they've identified the underlying emotions, what can they then turn to control, but also how can they soothe themselves when they are feeling, dissociated or really heightened or
mm,
just beyond, because those are the things that are leading them to those perfectionistic tendencies and challenging the perfectionism. But if somebody is going so far down or it's becoming dangerous, that's when I might say, okay, you know what, this is becoming an issue. I might refer them to see a specialist in that
mm.
area. But if it is sort of this obsessive thing and it's not dangerous, then we are looking at all of those factors.
Yeah, yeah. Those are important factors to look at anyway for, for
Yeah.
us outside of the space. Yeah. Jumping back to grief for a second, what is there anything that you think, any suggestions that you could give to caregivers who are grieving the loss of who their loved one used to be while still showing up for who they are now? Because again, like, that's tough, especially like this time of year, memories, traditions, things like that. So any kind of suggestions for how caregivers can kind of grieve that loss and still show up?
Yeah. Yeah. So grief can take over us. And
Hmm.
the first step is acknowledging and identifying what it is, naming that it is grief if you can. And then once we do name that it's grief, trying to make those moments where we are actually acknowledging, processing the loss and the grief, whatever that might look like. And I have examples that I've used in practice, so for example, some people decide to do like a memory album and they'll
Mm.
cry as they're making, but then that's if they need to channel their grief, we're giving them like 20-minute grief moments during their day where
Yeah.
they're looking through this memory album they made and they're crying, or just finding a way to channel it. And so then you're going on in your life and trying to experience joy as much as you can, but also recognizing that grief doesn't just go away and it
Hmm.
stays with us, and we have to accept the fact that it's going to be there when it needs to be there. And then we can dull the volume level down a little bit at other times, but there is an expectation on people to show up in this, perfect way, and we can give ourselves permission to put on this happy face for small moments, but then also make sure that we are processing the grief
Hmm.
and taking care of ourselves outside of those moments where we're putting on a face. So what are you
Yeah.
doing before and after this event? How are you establishing boundaries during? So if you're feeling really overwhelmed, can you take some space, take a step away, find a safe person to call, and make all of those plans ahead of time for
Hmm.
yourself. Grounding strategies and grounding techniques. But a lot of people want to push grief away and say, well, I can have the grief and then I can have not the grief.
Hmm.
And what I work with clients on is recognizing that we can't just push feelings away. it's
Yeah.
it's an acceptance that it will be there when it needs to be there, and it ebbs and flows, and it's not constant.
Hmm. Yeah, and accepting the emotion to show up when it needs to,
Yeah,
and again,
exactly.
having compassion for yourself through it, because it's tough and the grief is there. It wants to be noticed. You mentioned boundary setting. And so what boundary setting challenges come up for caregivers during the holiday season? I mean, we already touched on some around, like, drinking and letting our loved ones drive, or family gatherings, but what are some other ones you've noticed?
Well, a lot of us have decided over the years to, for example, not have certain relationship ties with some people in our family, or we minimize how we interact with people,
Hmm.
or we decide I can see this person twice a year, but I don't want to see them any other time. So, unfortunately, family gatherings are the perfect place for us to have to let go of all of those things, because
Yeah.
Auntie Susie, who you might have decided you didn't want to talk to very much, is there, and Uncle Billy is there, and all these
Hmm.
other people are there, and you have to put on a happy face. So we are definitely defying those boundaries. But also, if we're introverted, or we have these boundaries where I like to be home at 6 p.m., and that's my unwinding routine, we're also defying those boundaries. So a lot of things that we're doing in our lives day to day kind of have to be toppled over if you want to show face, right? And some
Hmm.
people say I'm not showing face anyway, so I'm not doing that. It's not worth it. But if you are, then for sure, there's a lot of things that you're doing to override these very purposeful boundaries you've put in place.
Yeah. Yeah. And what are some healthy boundaries that individuals can set during this time with
Right. Yeah.
themselves, with their caregiver, or with family?
Yeah. So it is very much, what do I do before, after, and during? So I will talk to people about, how do we set up ourselves for as much success as we can during the holiday event. And so that when we're there, if we are feeling overwhelmed, we have an exit plan, we have a
Hmm.
strategy to calm ourselves down, even if it's at the table. We have a point person if we're not able to take care of the person in the moment. Can there be somebody else that we kind of call on or flag to say,
Hmm.
hey, I need you to step in? And then how are we dealing with the come down of the event after the fact? And what are things that we can do for ourselves, right? Can we minimize the time that we're spending engaging with people? Can we turn our phone off for a bit? Can we take a day off work? Can we take space for ourselves? Can we have someone else step in afterwards so that we can decompress, so we can show up as best as we can for the person we're caring for after too? Because that
Hmm.
stuff doesn't stop. But
Right.
what's really important is that we're able to manage our own selves and our own emotions. And these events that tend to really challenge us do take us out of our comfort zone, and it can take us a week or more to regulate.
It kind of just stays stuck in us. And so we need a
Yeah.
little bit more time. How can caregivers create small moments of rest and peace?
Yeah. So rest in peace is tough as a caregiver, especially a caregiver who is struggling financially, a caregiver who can't afford to get support, can't find support, or feels like they have been just completely let down by everybody around them. So Very small moments can make a big difference as long as
Hmm.
we are present and mindful in those moments, right? So, making a cup of coffee in like a really nice mug and paying attention to the coffee, which many of us don't do because we're always distracted, but
Hmm.
taking that moment to not be distracted for 5 minutes, looking out the window, observing nature, being present in yourself, noticing how your body feels, noticing where you feel tension, taking a minute here and there to say, oh my gosh, I'm really feeling something in my shoulder. I must be really stressed. Let's, move
Mm.
my shoulders down. Trying to take walks. And if you can't get a walk in without the person you care for, can you bring them even in a wheelchair if that's
Yeah.
possible and they're able to transfer to a chair? Going to a new place to walk. So getting new scenery, new environments, and can you occupy your person, whether that's television or while they're napping or whatever it might be, so that you can then take small moments for yourself? Again, it's not going to be like big, there's this misconception that, oh, if you care for yourself as a caregiver, you're going to the spa for a day or taking a week vacation. Like that's not realistic for
Mm.
the majority of people. So we have to look at those very small, very purposeful moments, and also
Yeah.
recognize how you are spending your free time. I'm guilty of this, but are we scrolling on our phone all day, like living with our head down? Or are
Mm.
we actually observing life and taking in life? What are you doing with your moments? Because scrolling on your phone is actually making your stress level higher and you're not
Hmm.
realizing it, or it's making you compare yourself to other people too. So,
Yeah.
those are very small differences, but it frees up a lot of space too.
Yeah. And it's reminding me of an episode we had in season one about the different types of rest. Like it can
Oh,
feel like we're resting, but we're actually not. Our brain's constantly getting hit with all of these comparisons, like all of these other things when we're on our phone. And so it might feel like we're like quote unquote resting, but really maybe our body is resting because it's laying down, but mentally it's not. And it, like, again, physiologically, we might be holding a lot of the emotions within our body when without really being able to notice it. You mentioned like making meaningful moments or for a caregiver so that they're able to find a little bit of those times for rest and peace. But what about creating meaningful moments during the holidays when it is looking a little bit differently between the caregiver and the loved one who's yeah.
yeah. So again, it depends on the dynamic and the relationship, right? You may not want to create meaningful moments, and
Sure.
I think that that's totally fair. But if this is a person that you have had nice memories with, again, depending on their ability, what their diagnosis is, what's going on, right? Can we do some sort of a craft with them? Is there something they enjoy that we can do together, like listen to music or do some
Mm.
movement, even if they're in a chair? What do they enjoy? Because I think if they're enjoying it, we're more likely to enjoy it too. If we're
Yeah.
forcing them to do something, they're not going to enjoy it. And then it's just going to cause chaos for us, which I think we
Yeah,
can
we'll be
understand
frustrated.
having
Hmm.
kids. If we
Hmm.
try to assert our enjoyment on them, they're going to be like,
Yeah.
I don't like this. But if they tell us what they like, we might be like, okay. But then at least it turns into something that's a little bit more
Yeah.
enjoyable for the two. So it may not be exactly what you would have hoped for in the past, and that's hard. And we're going to name the emotions around that. But
Hmm.
what can you compromise on doing together?
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. And it's something that both of them or both of you can kind of do together and have
Yeah.
that moment. And yes, when anytime you try to, give anything, you're just full of frustration and this expectation that it's going to be so beautiful and actually it's
It's
not.
all about the expectation, right? When we
Yeah.
set
Yeah.
ourselves up with this expectation of it's going to be amazing, like I'm about to tell our kids that we're going somewhere and I have a very
Yeah.
strong, like I picture this being such a wonderful moment, and I can guarantee you that one of my kids can be like, that's so dumb or
Yeah.
something like that. And initially that hurts, but now I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, whatever. So it is about the expectation, right?
It
If we
is.
set ourselves up for a large expectation, you're pretty certainly going to have a very large fall, right?
Yeah, and disappointment,
And
and then it's
disappointment.
gonna come out, yeah, all of those things. Um, Thank you for all of the information. It has all been lovely. And I want to know kind of like what message do you want kind of every overwhelmed caregiver who may be listening today to hear as they're kind of moving through the season?
Yeah, I think I would say our moments are not forever. And it can feel when we're very intensely in a situation or when something's really, really hard that this is going to be forever and this is my life and I'm trapped. But the truth is that nothing is forever. And so, even though you're feeling overwhelmed or even though things are not figured out right now, they will figure themselves out. So, just
Mhm.
take each moment as the moment and then deal with the next moment as that moment. Because I can't tell you how many times a client has said to me in practice, this is horrible and I'm so overwhelmed. And then fast forward a few weeks, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so just know that things pass.
Hmm. Yeah, that's important. And also it hopefully alleviates some of the this is going to be forever because
Right.
it may not be. And then I wanted to know because we've talked so much about caregivers and how isolating it can be for them to be in that space. Is there anything that you would like to, any kind of messages that you want to give to the people around the caregiver? And so if anyone listening has a friend or is a sibling of another person who's actually being the primary caregiver to a loved one, like, yeah, any messages for them on how to support the caregiver?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are very well intentioned and say, how can I help you? But the caregiver usually, I mean, they're usually a person who will step forward and not want help, or they feel guilty about help.
Mm,
You need to be very specific. And in fact, if you're dealing with someone like me who's very stubborn, you actually just have to do the thing.
mm,
And it's scary to have to do the thing and hope that, you have the best outcome. But they're not going to tell you what they want. And so one big thing is, oh, but I tried, right? I told them, I said, tell me when you're ready. They're not going to tell
mm.
you. Just do it.
Right.
Just do the thing.
Yeah. And also like the decision and the mental load of trying to think about
Yeah.
something to tell the other person, it can
It's too
add
much.
to their overwhelm.
Yeah.
And so,
That's
yeah,
right.
take something on for them, listen to the caregiver and see what they need. Did they remember to eat? Maybe you can send them off some food or just do something else to kind of be able to support the caregiver.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, thank you so much, Steph. This has been so much fun and
Mhm.
also very informative. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's www.compassionincaregiving.com. I'm also on social media, most active on Instagram, which is at Compassion in Caregiving. And you can find my podcast wherever you find podcasts at Caregivers Compass.
Yeah, we'll link all of that in the show notes so it's easily accessible for folks. But thank you so much again. This was so fun.
Thanks. It was such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for making this
Yeah,
space.
of course. And everyone stay tuned for our next episode. It's going to be our last one for 2025. So make sure you hear that one next week. And thank you so much for being here. Bye. Thank you for listening to Outside the Therapy Room. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you reside in Ontario and are interested in working with one of our therapists, please visit our website in the show notes. If you reside outside of Ontario, a quick Google search or search through Psychology Today will help you find a therapist near you.